Section 82 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World Story, Volume 3, Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 82, Advancing Upon the Enemy, 1903 to 1904, by Gustav Frenssen. Before midnight we advanced toward the enemy. It was said that our division would come upon them about morning. The Witt boys rode on ahead as spies. Then came our company. One part was detached to ride at the side of the road in the bush. The other part was to keep on riding in the road. I was in the 3rd platoon. Behind me, in compact array, came the artillery. We marched as quietly as possible, but still there were all sorts of noises, snorting of horses, jolting of wheels, an impatient, angry shout, or a blow with a whip. I was very cold in the saddle, and in order not to have stiff fingers later, when I had to shoot, I laid the reins over my cartridge belt and put my hands in my pockets. At last morning broke, and delicate rosy stripes of light soon shot up toward the zenith. The colors grew rapidly deeper, brighter, and stronger. The red was glorious in its fullness, and the blue beautiful in its purity. The light mounted and extended itself, ascending like a new world, 1,000 times more beautiful than the old one. Then came the sun, big and clear, looking like a great placid wide-open eye. Although, like a good soldier, I had all my thoughts fixed on what was before me, on the enemy, and the bad hours I should probably meet with, yet I saw the splendor of the sky. Near me rode a fellow from Hamburg, a fresh, quiet boy. He said once to me, "You see, one has to have experienced something, or how shall one become a serious, capable man? That's why I came here." He was to enter his father's business later. He was riding just as I was, his reins over his cartridge belt, and his hands in his pockets. He was frowning this morning, and kept a sharp lookout before him. Diagonally behind me rode the former officer. About this time of day, according to the predictions of our scouts, we ought to reach the enemy, but they were not to be seen. Then I thought, as did many others, that again there would be no fighting, and I was annoyed. Shortly after this, however, we heard the thunder of cannon coming from our right. It got to be 8 o'clock and 9. The bush was so dense that the party sent into it could not advance. They came out and marched together along the road. The sun was steadily mounting. It was getting to be a hot day. It began to be warm riding, and the horses were growing tired. A little thin lieutenant with a drawn face and sharp eyes rode up alongside of me and said in a suppressed voice, "We aren't a mile and a half from the water holes." Several times in the last few days he had made dangerous excursions into this region, and he knew every bush. Then the first shot fell ahead. With a quick swing we were out of our saddles, and had thrown the reins over our horses' necks. Those who were to hold the horses seized them. Our company was only 90 strong, and as we left 10 with the horses, only 80 men went into the thick bush. The enemy were firing vigorously and letting out short, wild cries. I saw one of our men wounded. He stooped and examined a wound in his leg. Still I saw nothing of the enemy. Then, just for a second, I saw a piece of an arm in a grayish-brown cord coat, and I shot at it. Then I lay down to spy out another target. Lively firing was being exchanged. When one of us thought he had hit his mark, he would announce it with a loud voice, "That one won't get up again. I got him in the middle of the breast." The third man at my right, who was lying by a bush in front of me, twitched convulsively. A derisive voice on the other side shouted, "Had enough, Dutchman?" My comrade said in a quiet voice, "I have a bullet in my shoulder," and he crawled back on all fours. I could hear through all our own shooting that we were getting fired upon from the left. This fire now became heavier. They were coming nearer. In close ranks they came, creeping and shouting and screaming. Two of my neighbors were not shouting any more. We crawled back once or twice our length. The enemy shouted, "Look out, Dutchman, look out," and laughed wildly. Others shouted, "Hurrah, hurrah!" The bush was swarming with men. I thought they would now break loose upon us in a wild storm, and that it would be all up with us. On account of our wounded men, I was fearfully anxious lest we should have to retreat. I was firmly resolved, if the command should come, to shout loudly, "Take along the wounded." But when I had just decided on this plan, a subordinate officer came up with several men, and cheered us on with the words, "Hold your position, I am sending aid." Soon afterwards I heard something slipping and grating behind me, and a quiet, soft voice said, "Move a little to the side." The nozzle of a machine gun was pushed forward near my face, and immediately began to crackle away. The grape shot hissed furiously into the bushes, rattling and whizzing. How good it sounded! How surely and quietly I shot! Did I hit? Did you see? Shoot, man! There! There! Cannon, too, upon a slope behind us, were now thundering over our heads. Then it grew a little more quiet on the other side, and the command of "Forward, double quick!" reached us. We sprang up and plunged forward, but a horrible volley of grape shot was poured against us and threw us back again. In front of me an under officer had got a ball in the body, and blood was streaming from the wound. He was crouching and trying to stem the flow of blood with a handkerchief, and was calling for help. He was a light complexioned, fine looking man. Just then the former officer, the one who was under the official ban, came up from the side, seized the wounded man by the shoulders, and dragged him back, while balls were falling around him, and the barrel of his gun was hit so that it flew rattling to one side. He then quietly lay down in his place again. On the other side in the bush they were shouting in wild zeal, and shrieking for very rage. We did not advance. I don't know how long we lay there firing. It was probably hours. I wondered once why no officer was to be seen with us, and I forgot it again. Sweat ran like water over my entire body. Not merely my tongue, but my throat, my whole body, cried out for a swallow of cool water. At one side a hospital aide was trying to bind a rubber bandage around the bleeding leg of a wounded man, who begged him in South German dialect, "Take me back a little, can you?" Then the aide dragged him back panting. The fire from the other side was getting weaker. A voice commanded us, "Fire more slowly." From the other side we heard it jeeringly mimicked, "Fire more slowly." A wounded man cried aloud for water. We lay and waited, our guns pointed. Word passed from mouth to mouth, "The captain is dead, the first lieutenant too, all the officers, and almost all the under officers." Propping my gun in position, I took my field flask with my left hand, and swallowed the little draught I had saved up for the greatest emergency. As I set the flask aside, I thought that perhaps it would be my last drink, and I thought of my parents. I believed that the enemy would get breath, and then make another assault. But that did not happen. A lieutenant who belonged to the staff came stooping along our ranks. When he was behind me, he knelt there, touched my boot lightly, and said, "Go to the General and report that according to my reckoning we are about a half a mile distant from the last water holes." I got cautiously up on my knees, and then ducking down, ran back to the road. Near an ant hill, which was certainly 3 yards high, a surgeon and a hospital aide were endeavoring to save a man from bleeding to death, but I believe they came too late, for he lay like dead on his dark red blanket. Then I saw the balloon not far in front of me, and I ran across the clearing to it. The long rows of oxen, standing in harness in front of their wagons, raised their open mouths and bellowed hoarsely, for they scented the water holes and panted for water. The soldiers at the wagons and horses called to me with dry voices, "Get ahead, you fellows up forward! Are we coming to water soon? Are we going on?" They looked at me with deep, dry eyes. Those who held the horses had a great deal of trouble with the thirsty creatures, which were standing crowded together, swarmed over, and tortured by insects. The sun scorched down. A thick, horribly dry, dust-filled air lay over the whole camp. The surgeons in white cloaks stood in front of the hospital wagon around a table on which some one was lying. I wondered how many were lying in the shade of the wagon. 5 or 6 of them were dead, among them our captain. A wounded officer, I think it was a lieutenant, was giving water with his well hand to the severely wounded. His other arm was bleeding badly. At the general's wagon a man was standing by the heliograph. The general was near by with officers and orderlies around him, all of them on foot. I reported, and heard some one say, "The animals can't hold out any longer, and the men are simply dying of thirst." The next moment, just as I had turned to run to the front, there came from behind, from 2 or 3 directions, wild shouting and volleys from the bush. The outposts, who were lying and kneeling on the ground all around, moved in immediately. The voice of an officer rang out sharp and clear, "Disperse and charge in knots." I ran, and saw as I ran that a hailstorm of bullets was riddling the hospital wagon, that the doctors were seizing their guns, and that one of them was wounded. I even heard one say, "We'll take off our white cloaks, though." Then I lay down by a bush and shot at the enemy, who with wild shouts continued their onset through the bushes. Secretaries, orderlies, drivers, guard, and officers all rushed forward, lay down near one another, and protected their skins. The artillery turned while firing, and shot away over us. Excited by my run and the sudden attack, I began a violent rapid fire. A voice near me said, "Shoot more calmly." I did fire more calmly, thinking, "Who said that?" And as I seized my cartridge belt and looked to the side, there lay the general, 2 men from me, shooting coolly as becomes an old soldier. The enemy were pressing on in close ranks through the bush, shouting and firing, but we lay quietly and shot well. Then it got more quiet. The officer stood up and returned to the center of the camp again. Immediately after that came the order that the whole camp should advance 200 yards. In running by, I saw them lifting the dead and wounded into wagons. Then I ran forward again to my place in the line of defense. Now as I lay there, I felt how very parched I was. Begging and complaining and teasing for water went through the ranks. From behind we heard the hoarse lowing of the thirsty oxen. I believe that at this time, 4 in the afternoon, there was not a drop of water in the whole camp except for the wounded. Then everything was moved to the front, soldiers, artillery, and machine guns. A terrific fire rattled against the enemy, who were growing weary. Then word passed from man to man, "We are going to charge." Now the battle cry told. I shall never forget it. With fierce yells, with distorted faces, with dry and burning eyes, we sprang to our feet and hurled ourselves forward. The enemy leaped, fired, and dispersed with loud outcries. We ran without interference, shouting, cursing, and shooting, to the good-sized clearing where the ardently desired water holes were, and across it to the farther edge where the bush began again. The entire camp, the heavy wagons with their long teams of oxen, the hundreds of horses, the hospital wagons with the surgeons, the dead and the wounded, the headquarters, everything followed in a rush and encamped in the clearing. But we lay around it at the edge of the bush to keep back the enemy, who now here and now there would break through the thick bushes in wild, loudly shouting parties. Behind us our men were now climbing down with army kettles into the water holes, which were 10 yards deep, and were filling buckets let down on reins, and were beginning to water man and beast. When about 10 animals had had a little, the hole was empty. There were about 10 or 12 holes at this place. The sun went down. Some of us slipped out, cut brush with our side arms, and made a stockade in front of us. The artillerymen set up the cannon and machine guns behind us and knelt near them. Some of the soldiers were detailed to creep from man to man and give each a little water. In the camp further back of us, the restlessly crowding animals were being watered in the dark. By the hospital wagons, nurses were going about, lanterns in their hands, bending over each patient. Meanwhile the enemy kept up their firing, which continually flashed out of the dark bush all around the camp. Not until about midnight did it become more quiet. We passed a little zwieback from hand to hand, then complete darkness settled upon us, and the shooting at last ceased. What plan had the enemy in mind? Here we lay in the dark night, 400 men, worn out and half dead with thirst, and in front of us and all around us a savage, furious people numbering 60,000. We knew and heard nothing of the other German divisions. Perhaps they had been slaughtered, and the 60,000 were now collecting themselves to fall upon us. Through the quiet night we heard in the distance the lowing of enormous herds of thirsty cattle, and a dull, confused sound like the movement of a whole people. To the east there was a gigantic glow of fire. I lay stretched at full length with my gun ready, and cheered my utterly exhausted comrades to keep awake. Thus morning gradually came on. Then some scouts went out cautiously, and we learned to our great amazement that the enemy had withdrawn, and indeed in wild flight. We should have liked to follow them up, but we had no news yet from the other divisions. Moreover, both men and beasts had reached the limit of their strength. So we rested on that day, ate a little poor food, and cleansed and repaired our guns and other equipment, for we looked like people who had battered and bruised and soiled themselves in an attack of frenzy. The madness still showed in our frowning brows and in our eyes. Our dead lay in the midst of us in the shade of a tree. We had a great deal of trouble to keep our animals from dying. We could not give them anywhere near enough water to satisfy them, and we could not give them any fodder at all, because the entire region had been eaten as bare by the enemy's cattle, as if rats and mice had gnawed it clean. The men and the animals had even grubbed into the earth in search of roots. It was a miserable day. The sun glared down, and an odor of old manure filled the whole land to suffocation. At noon there came at last some news from the other divisions. Two reported that they had beaten the enemy, the third that it had saved itself with great difficulty and distress. The enemy had fled to the east with their whole enormous mass, women, children, and herds. Toward evening we buried our dead under the tree. End of section 82. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 83 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, read for LibriVox.org. Arabia, Part 1, Early History. Historical Note. Little is known of the early history of Arabia, save that it was the home of many tribes, some with fixed abodes, but most of them wandering about as the mood seized them or some fancied advantage occurred to them. They had no permanent government, no laws, and no settled religion. Some worshipped the stars, some angels or heavenly spirits. When they came in contact with a nation, they usually borrowed some of its religious customs. They made images of their various deities and paid them great reverence. Persecuted Christians sometimes fled to Arabia, and by the end of the 6th century, a vague and inaccurate knowledge of Christianity had spread through much of the country. In the early part of the 7th century, Mohammed began to teach, and before many years he had gained a large number of followers. There is but one God, and Mohammed is his prophet, was the main tenet of his preaching. The Arabs accepted his faith, and this brought about their union, not only in religion, but also in government. After the death of Mohammed, his followers pressed on in their warfare, and by preaching and fighting they overran Syria and Persia and Central Asia. Their faith was adopted by the Turks. Egypt and northern Africa yielded to their arms. They conquered Spain so completely that in the greater part of the country the customs, dress, and language, as well as religion, became that of Arabia. Europe seemed about to fall into their hands, but in 732, exactly a century after the death of Mohammed, the Mohammedans were met at Tours by Charles Martel and were overcome. Had the invaders been the victors, no one can estimate the length of time that the civilization of Europe would have been retarded. End of section 83. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 84 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Farnood Jahangiri. The World's Story, Volume 3, Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 84. The Legend of the Arabs, by Alphonse Marie Louis de Lamartine. Tradition says that Nimrod, the fabulous king of Babylon, heard a prophecy that a child should be born who would become greater than himself and all the rest of mankind. To prevent this, he forbade marriage. Nevertheless, the father of Abraham took to himself a wife. When the child was born, his parents, in order to save his life, hid him in a cave outside the city, and thither the angels came and cared for him. Editor. Abraham, nursed by the angels, grew in strength and intellect in his cavern. His first egression from it was by night. The firmament of Chaldea, filled with luminous creatures that floated in the ether, revealed to him God. Only he was not yet able to distinguish him from his works. A star resplendent beyond the others first arrested his dazzled eyes. "There is my God!" exclaimed he to himself. Presently the star descended and disappeared in the horizon. "No," said he, "that cannot be the God whom I adore." So with several other constellations. Afterwards the moon arose. "There is my God!" cried he, and it said, "No, it is not my God." In fine, the sun rose majestically in the east, at the border of the forest. "Here truly is my God," said he. "It is large and dazzling beyond all others." The sun accomplished his career and went down in the horizon, leaving the mantle of night upon the earth. "That is not still the God I look for to adore," muttered pensively the infant destined for the adoration of the divinity invisible, immovable, and eternal. He returned to his cavern to seek his God in his own soul. Having left at length his cave and been presented to Nimrod as a young man born long before the interdiction of the marriages, Abraham began revealing to the Babylonians the immaterial God, exhorting them to worship in spirit and in truth, and to eject the idols from the temples. The priests of Babylon led the profaner of the idols before Nimrod to have him punished. "Who then is your God?" demanded the king of the young prophets. "My God," said Abraham, "is he who giveth life and death." "It is I who give life and death," rejoined Nimrod. To prove it, he ordered into his presence from the prisons of Babylon 2 criminals condemned to death and who were awaiting execution. He cut off the head of one, he gave pardon to the other, and supposed his interlocutor confounded. But Abraham, at first perplexed how to refute this sophism in action, soon recovered himself and offered the king a challenge of omnipotence. "Very well," said he. "My God is he who makes the sun to rise in the east. Do you make it rise in the west?" Nimrod replied, as embarrassed tyrants do, "by fire." He had the youthful prophet thrown into a burning pyre. "But the fire became cold," says the history. Abraham retired into the deserts of Mesopotamia with his family, his slaves, and his flocks. There commenced the Hebrews, the Arabs of the Bible and of Jerusalem, the sons of Isaac. Let us turn to those of the desert and of Mecca, the sons of Ishmael. It was upon the future site of this city, a site then without inhabitants and without water, that Abraham, in deference to the jealousy of his wife Sarah, abandoned his slave Hagar and the child he had by her, Ishmael. Scarce had the unfortunate Hagar exhausted the provisions of dates and water which Abraham had left her for herself and her son, than she felt the torments of thirst and ran desperately through the valleys and parched ravines of Safa, asking them in vain for a single drop of water or the oozing moisture of a rock to wet the lips of her infant. During this absence of his mother, Ishmael cried with impatience and thirst, and striking in his anger with his heel upon the sand, there issued thence a fountain of cool and pure water. Hagar hastened back to the wailings of her son. She saw the water, and fearing lest it should evaporate in the sun or disappear in the sand, she set to kneading the moistened earth in her hands, and shaped it into a basin to retain the treasure. This miraculous water, which flows still at the present day, is the source of the famous wells of Zamzam of Mecca, which have the virtue of sanctifying the drinkers. Some Arab shepherds of a wandering tribe were pasturing their camels on the sides of the Mount Arafat in the neighborhood. They saw some eagles fighting overhead the site where the prodigy had just taken place. Suspecting that the birds had smelt the moisture, they hastened thither. They found the spring, the young mother, and the child. "Who are you, and what is this child?" asked they of Hagar. "Whence comes this water? We have never before seen it during these many years that we traversed these solitudes." Hagar related to them her abandonment. They took compassion on her. The child, for whom the earth seemed to have opened like a mother's breast, appeared to them a being predestined for celestial benedictions. They announced this prodigy to the tribe, who came to dwell upon the spot. Ishmael grew up in the midst of this people. He married one of their daughters named Amara. Abraham made them 2 visits with the permission of Sarah. Sarah, still jealous, had exacted as condition that Abraham should not dismount from his horse at the lodgings of Hagar. The first time Abraham visited Mecca, he stopped at the door of Ishmael and called him by his name. Amara, the wife of Ishmael, came to the door. "Where is Ishmael?" inquired the patriarch without dismounting. "He is hunting," replied Amara. "Have you nothing to give me to eat? For I cannot come down." "I have nothing," said Amara. "This country is a desert." "Very well," rejoined Abraham. "Say to your husband that you have seen a stranger. Describe to him my figure, and tell him that I recommend him to change the threshold of his door." Amara, on the return of Ishmael, acquitted herself of the message. Her husband, offended that she had refused his father hospitality, repudiated her and married a woman of another tribe named Saidah. Abraham returned some time after to visit her son. He was absent. A young, slim, and graceful woman came to the threshold of the door to make reply to the stranger. "Have you some nourishment to give me?" asked Abraham of his daughter-in-law, without making himself known or dismounting from his horse. "Yes," said she in an instant. And going into the house, she returned soon after, presenting to the traveler some cooked venison, milk, and dates. Abraham tasted the edibles, then blessed them in saying, "May God multiply in this country these 3 species of nutriment." After the repast, Saidah said to the old man, "Dismount from your horse, that I may bathe your head and your beard." "I cannot," replied the patriarch. "I am under oath not to quit the saddle." And merely setting one foot upon a large stone beside the door, while the other leg continued astride on the saddle, he in this way stooped his head within reach of the young woman, who laved away the dust wherewith his eyes and beard were soiled. "When your husband returns," said the patriarch on departing, "describe to him my figure, and say to him from me that the threshold of his door is alike beautiful and solid, and that he take good care not to change it." Ishmael, upon hearing this recital and these words, said to Saidah, "He whom you have seen is my father, and he orders me in this wise to keep you carefully forever." In a third visit to his son, Abraham built conjointly with him at Mecca a temple or house of God, called Kabah. This temple, which is still at this day the temple of Mecca, was a small and shapeless structure, without window, or door, or roof, constructed of unhewn blocks of stone. Abraham did the mason work, and his son Ishmael quarried the stones. They inserted in one of the walls the famous black stone, which an angel was supposed to have conveyed direct from heaven to sanctify the house of the deity. They instituted pilgrimage rites and processions around the edifice, which have made subsequently of Mecca the religious capital of Arabia, and which Mohammed was obliged to retain with a change of spirit after his reform. But be it as it may with these mythological traditions, Mecca became through the processions of the Kabah the object of the pilgrimage and the center of the superstitions of all the Arabs who were not adorers of Jehovah. And idolatry dethroned the pure worship of Abraham and peopled the Kaaba with idols. End of section 84. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Farnood.
Section 85 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. The World Story, Volume 3, Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 85. Mohammed, about 570 to 632. By Eva March Tappan. Mohammed was born in Mecca in Arabia, and he became so famous when a man that the people who knew him as a boy came to believe in many wonderful things as having happened to him when he was small. It was said that the sheep bowed to him as he passed by, and that even the moon stooped from her place in the heavens to do him honor. While he was in the house of his nurse, so the legend says, her well never dried, and her pastures were always fresh and green. The little boy soon lost both father and mother, and was brought up in the house of his uncle. He must have been a most lovable boy, for everyone seems to have been kind to him. This uncle held an office of great honor. He was guardian of a certain black stone which, it was said, the angel Gabriel had given to Abraham. The stone was built into the outer wall of the Kabah, a little square temple which the Arabians looked upon as especially holy. Most of them were worshippers of idols, and the Kabah was the home of enough idols to provide a different one for every day in the year. Throngs of pilgrims journeyed to Mecca to kiss the stone and worship in the Kabah, and the boy must have heard marvelous tales of the strange places from which they came. His uncle was a merchant and used to go with caravans to Syria and elsewhere to get goods. When Mohammed was 12 years old, he begged earnestly to be allowed to go with him. The uncle said no. Then the boy pleaded, "But, my uncle, who will take care of me when you are gone?" The tender-hearted man could not refuse any longer, and Mohammed went on his first journey. After this he always traveled with his uncle, and when the uncle went out to help his tribe fight another one, he became the uncle's armor-bearer. He learned about life in a caravan, and about buying and selling goods, and while he was hardly more than a boy, he was often employed by merchants to go on such trips as their agent. At length he was engaged by a wealthy widow named Khadijah to manage the large business which the death of her husband had left her in charge. She became more and more pleased with the young man, and after a while she sent a trusty slave to offer him her hand. He was surprised, but not at all unwilling, and soon there was a generous wedding feast with music and dancing. The house was open to all who chose to come, and a camel was killed that its flesh might be given to the poor. Mohammed thought much about religious questions. He came to believe that his people were wrong in worshipping idols, and that there was only one true God. He used to go to a cavern a few miles from Mecca to pray and meditate. 1 month in every year he gave up entirely to this. After a while he began to have strange dreams and visions. In one of these he thought the angel Gabriel held before him a silken cloth on which there was a golden writing and bade him read it. "But I do not know how to read," replied Mohammed. "Read in the name of the Most High," said the angel. And suddenly the power to read the letters came to him, and he found the writings were commands of God. Then the angel declared, "Thou art the prophet of God." Mohammed told Khadijah of his vision, and she believed that the angel had really come to him. After a little he began to preach wherever people would listen. A few believed in him, but most people only laughed at his story. Still he kept on preaching, and after a while, although he had but few followers in Mecca, there were many in Medina who had come to believe that he was the prophet of God. He decided that it was best for him to go to them, and in the year 622 he and a few friends escaped from their enemies in Mecca and went to Medina. This is called the Hegira, or flight. To this day Mohammedans do not count the years from the birth of Christ, but from the Hegira. As soon as the Prophet was in Medina, his followers began to build a mosque, or place for prayer, in which he might preach. They made the walls of earth and brick. The pillars were the trunks of palm trees, and the roof was formed of their branches, with a thatch of leaves. He decided that his disciples should be called to prayer 5 times a day, and after all these centuries the call, or muezzin, is still heard in the east from some minaret of each mosque. God is great. There is no God but God. Mohammed is the apostle of God. Come to prayers. Come to prayers. At dawn the crier adds, prayer is better than sleep. Every true Mussulman, as followers of Mohammed are called, is bound to obey this rule of prayer, and as he prays he must turn his face toward Mecca. He is also commanded to make at least 1 pilgrimage to Mecca before he dies, and to kiss the sacred black stone. It is still in the wall of the Kabah, but the Kabah itself is now within a mosque so large that it will hold 35,000 persons. It is probable that Mohammed never learned to read or write, but his followers jotted down his words on bits of palm leaves or skins or even the shoulder blades of animals, and many of them they learned by heart. After the death of the Prophet, the caliphs, as his successors were called, collected these sayings and arranged them in a book called the Koran, which is the sacred volume of the Mussulmans. For a long while Mohammed preached peace and gentleness and charity, and he won many followers. Then he came to believe that if people would not obey his teachings, it was right to make war upon them. He marched against Mecca with a large army of his disciples, and soon captured it. After a time, either by preaching or by fighting, the Mohammedans, or Mussulmans, became the rulers of all Arabia. After the death of their prophet, they continued their conquests. They overcame Syria, Persia, Egypt, northern Africa, and Spain. A little later they swarmed over the Pyrenees mountains, and pushed on as far north as Tours. In 732, just 100 years after the death of Mohammed, the Mohammedans and the Franks met in battle on the plain of Tours, and after a terrible combat the Mohammedans were so completely overwhelmed that they retreated toward Spain and never again tried to conquer the land of the Franks. End of section 85. This recording is in the public domain. Section 86 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. Read for LibriVox.org by April 6090, California, United States of America. Reading from the Koran. Painting, page 496. A reading from the Koran by William Carl Gentz, Germany, 1822 to 1890. Good Muslims believe that in the beginning a tablet rested beside the throne of God, and that upon this tablet the Koran was written by rays of light. Portions of its teachings were, according to Mohammedan faith, revealed to Mohammed from time to time. The utmost reverence is always shown to any copy of the book, and no one may even touch it without ceremonial purification. In the teachings of the Koran, there is little that is original. It demands belief in one God and in Mohammed as his prophet. Charity and kindness to others are enjoined. The good Mohammedan must drink no spirituous liquor. He must pray 5 times a day with his face turned toward Mecca, and at some time in his life he must, if possible, make a pilgrimage to the holy city. The language of the Koran is regarded as the purest Arabic. The picture represents one of the Mohammedan priests explaining the sacred book to the little audience who have come together to listen to him in the shade of the old stone portico. All wear the flowing robes of the East, but have, as is the custom, removed their shoes on entering the building. The palm at the right hand makes a graceful frame for the scene. Pigeons, but little disturbed by the coming of people, are fluttering about the shelf of rock. Beside the expounder lies a cat, who, in perfect confidence in these friendly folk, does not trouble herself even to keep a watchful eye upon them. She is introduced in memory of the time when Mohammed cut off the loose sleeve of his robe rather than disturb a cat who had chosen it as a place for her siesta. End of section 86. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 87 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. The World Story Volume 3, Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 87. The Square House, or Kabah, by Hadji Khan and Wilfrid Sparroy. The square house, or Kabah, stands almost in the center of the harem, rather nearer to the west than to the east. Footnote. Harem here means courtyard of the mosque. End of footnote. The ground whereon it lies is accounted holy, since it was here that Adam, after his expulsion from the Garden of Eden, first worshipped his Creator, a tent being sent down from heaven for the purpose. This act of grace on the part of the heavenly host was the compassionate result of a conference over which the archangel Gabriel had presided. There was substituted for the tent by Adam's son, Seth, a structure of clay and stone, which was rebuilt at a later period, under the superintendence of Abraham and Ishmael his son. So much for the legendary history of the house. The task of restoring the sacred edifice, in the time of ignorance, fell to the lot of the 4 chief tribes of Arabia. It was rebuilt by the Quraysh a few years after Mohammed's birth and was destroyed by the Torrents 35 years after its completion. Then ensued a tribal war, each of the clans claiming for itself a complete side of the house which should face its tents, till the cause of strife was settled by an agreement among the contending tribes to accept the arbitration of Abu Amid, the chief of the Quraysh. The decision of Abu Amid was that the tribe should abide by the determination of the man who, on the following Friday afternoon, should be the first to leave the mosque. So haphazard an arrangement was bound to appeal to the sportsmanlike instinct of a race that has ever been wont to test the wisdom of its actions by the arbitrament of chance. The warriors sheathed their swords, and when the fateful day arrived not a single murmur was raised against the man who, being the first to reach the open air, set about planning the building as it now appears. This man, it is said, was Mohammed. The Kabah, which was certainly reconstructed in the year 1627, the successive sharifs and sultans adding to its interior decorations, is said to have been destroyed and restored 12 times since the death of the Prophet. In shape, the Kabah is an almost solid square, having from outside a length of 14 yards, and being 11 yards broad and 16 yards high. From afar it has the look of an immense block of dark-colored granite. The double roof is supported from within by pillars of aloe wood. The gateway, which fills a considerable portion of the eastern wall, is raised about 6 feet from the ground, and measures in height some 4 yards as far as I could gauge. The door itself is made of aloe wood, and is covered over with plates of solid silver and studded with heavy silver nails. The precious metal was presented to the house in 959 of the Hegira by the generous Sultan Soliman. Inlaid in the eastern end of the southern wall of the Kabah is the famous black stone, which might be said to be the center of the pilgrims' circling aspirations, and the pivot of their circumambulations round the sacred precincts. Another stone, marking the sepulchre of Ishmael, lies at the base of the northern wall, and from the roof above there projects a horizontal semicircular rainspout which, including the end fixed in the wall, is 5 yards long, measures 24 inches in width, and is made of massive gold. The water flows from the lip of the split pipe to the floor of the harem below. The tomb of Abraham, the legendary builder of the temple, is situated close by, to the east, not far from the gate of Beni Shaibeh. The Prophet's faithful followers, when they say their prayers, must turn their faces in the direction of the Kabah, no matter where they may be. This ascertaining of the exact position of the house of God, which is the center of the holy city, is called taking the Qibla, or outlook. Thus the Mohammedans of Syria, and those beyond it to the north, having fixed the Qibla, are face to face with the northern wall, sacred to the stone of Ishmael and the gold rainspout. Their prayers are therefore sure to be heard. Those of Persia, Turkestan, northern India, Sind, and a part of China, look in the direction of the northeastern angle, called the Rokne Aragi, which is an equally blessed outlook, since the door of the house is on the eastern side and rather more to the north than the south thereof. The faces of the Muslims of Aden, of southern India, of Madagascar, and of Australia are turned to the eastern wall, or the southeastern corner of it, while those of the faithful of Constantinople, as well as those of the Mohammedans of some parts of Russia, are opposite to the western wall of the sacred building. The Boers believe themselves to be the chosen people. It is a pity they are not Mohammedans, for if they were, they would be considered now the chosen people of Islam for the simple reason that they would face the southern wall of the Kabah, wherein is laid the black stone of immemorial sanctity. But the prayers the most acceptable to God, when all is said and done, are the prayers raised from any quarter within the harem of the house of Allah on earth. The interior of the Kabah is far more impressive than the exterior. The silver threshold is reached by means of a staircase running on wheels. There the pilgrim must prostrate himself, asking God to grant him his heart's desire. He must be careful to maintain the correct demeanor, closing his eyes and lifting up his hands, inasmuch as the angels, who are believed to keep watch over the entrance, are quick to resent the slightest breach in the prescribed ceremony. The guide who accompanied me assured me of the fact. He was good enough to see that I had forgotten neither my rosary of 99 beads corresponding with the wondrous names of God used in prayer, nor yet the lamp of clay, called More, whereon are stamped the selfsame names, together with those of the 12 Imams and the Prophet. It was on the clay that I bowed my head in contrition when I fell on my knees. My guide, who had also prostrated himself, expressed the conviction, on rising, that the angels were on his side. I was also about to declare myself to be on the side of the angels, when a couple of sturdy pilgrims, in their impatience to behold the light of their eyes, wedged me tight between their bulky forms and then hustled me to the ground, adding insult to injury by being obviously unconscious of the presence of my humble body. They were absent-minded beggars with a vengeance. When I had crossed the door-sill, I was overcome by a sense of my own unworthiness, so that I pardoned the men who had offended me. I raised my eyes. The ceiling was flat and supported on 3 columns of aloe wood, and from it hung vases of great beauty on delicate gold chains. The walls were covered with red velvet, save where in white squares were written in Arabic characters the words Allah Ja Jalala, praise to God the Almighty. The velvet is said to have been a gift from Sultan Abdul Aziz. In the corner formed by the northern and eastern walls there is a door leading to the roof. This door, which is called the Door of Repentance, is closed to the public, but a prayer said on the hither side of the threshold meets with a gracious response, and the pilgrim is clean washed of his sins if he but touch the wood with his hand. The floor is now flagged with marble, the work of some 20 years ago. End of section 87. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 88 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, read for LibriVox.org. Arabia, Part 2. Stories of the Caliphs of Baghdad. Historical note. Mohammed was succeeded by a line of caliphs, who, theoretically at least, were at the head of both religion and state. The greatest of these caliphs was Haroun Al Rashid, who ruled from 786 to 809, the hero of the Arabian Nights. Arabia was now in its most glorious days. Its caliph loved science and literature, and he had the works of numerous Greek and Latin authors translated into Arabic. Poetry flourished, and the court of the caliph was the home of education as well as of luxury. He had diplomatic relations with Charlemagne, and historians delight in describing the splendors of the embassy which he sent to that monarch and the superb presents which they carried. Among them was a magnificent tent, a water clock, and an elephant. Of more value than these, however, were the keys of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem, for this gift carried with it freedom for European pilgrims to visit the sacred place. From the 8th to the 13th centuries, the Arabs ruled nearly all the lands that had accepted Mohammedanism. One by one, these countries were lost to their control, and in the 16th century, the caliphate passed for a time into the hands of the Ottoman Turks. End of Section 88. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 89 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, read for LibriVox.org by T.J. Burns. Al-Mansur, builder of Baghdad, and the poet, 8th century A.D., adapted from the Arabic by Claude Field. Al-Mansur, the third Caliph of the House of Abbas, succeeded his brother El-Shafa, the Bloodshedder, A.D. 754. He was a prince of great prudence, integrity, and discretion, but these good qualities were sullied by his extraordinary covetousness and occasional cruelty. He patronized poets and learned men, and was endowed with a remarkable memory. It is said that he could remember a poem after having only once heard it. He also had a slave who could commit to memory anything that he had heard twice, and a slave girl who could do the same with what she had heard 3 times. One day there came to him a poet bringing a congratulatory ode, and Al-Mansur said to him, "If it appears that anybody knows it by heart, or that anyone composed it, that is to say, that it was brought here by some other person before thee, we will give thee no recompense for it, but if no one knows it, we will give thee the weight in money of that upon which it is written." So the poet repeated his poem, and the Caliph at once committed it to memory, although it contained 1,000 lines. Then he said to the poet, "Listen to it from me," and he recited it perfectly. Then he added, "And this slave too knows it by heart." This was the case, as he had heard it twice, once from the poet and once from the Caliph. Then the Caliph said, "And this slave girl, who is concealed by the curtain, she also recollects it." So she repeated every letter of it, and the poet went away unrewarded. Another poet, Al-Asma'i, was among the intimate friends and table companions of the Caliph. He composed some very difficult verses and scratched them upon a fragment of a marble pillar, which he wrapped in a cloak and placed on the back of a camel. Then he disguised himself like a foreign Arab and fastened on a face-cloth so that nothing was visible but his eyes, and came to the Caliph and said, "Verily I have lauded the commander of the faithful in a qasida ode." Then said Al-Mansur, "O brother of the Arabs, if the poem has been brought by anyone beside thee, we will give thee no recompense for it. Otherwise, we will bestow on thee the weight in money of that upon which it is written." So Al-Asma'i recited the qasida, which, as it was extraordinarily intricate and difficult, the Caliph could not commit to memory. He looked toward the slave and the girl, but they had neither of them learnt it. So he cried, "O brother of the Arabs, bring hither that whereon it is written, that we may give thee its weight." Then said the seeming Arab, "O my lord, of a truth I could find no paper to write it upon, but I had amongst the things left me at my father's death a piece of a marble column, which had been thrown aside as useless, so I scratched the qasida upon that." Then the Caliph had no help for it but to give him its weight in gold, and this nearly exhausted his treasury. The poet took it and departed. End of section 89. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.J. Burns.
Section 90 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. Read for LibriVox.org by Angelique, Campbell. Al-Mansur Rebuked. 8th century A.D. Adapted from the Arabic by Claude Field. Terrible as was the wrath of Al-Mansur when roused, there were not wanting on occasion those among his subjects who had the courage to rebuke him. Once the Caliph was addressing an audience at Damascus and said, "O ye people, it is incumbent on you to give praise to the Most High that he has sent me to reign over you. For verily, since I began to reign over you, he has taken away the plague which had come amongst you." But a certain Arab cried out to him, "Of a truth, Allah is too merciful to give us both thee and the plague at one time." On another occasion, the theologian Malik ibn Anis relates the following. One day, the Caliph Mansur sent for me and my friend Ibn Taus, against whom he was known to entertain a grudge. When we entered the presence chamber, we beheld the executioner with his sword drawn, and the leather carpet spread, on which it was customary to behead criminals. The Caliph signed to us to seat ourselves, and when we had done so, he remained a long time with his head bent in meditation. He then raised it, and turning to Ibn Tawas said, "Recite me a saying of the Prophet, on whom be peace." Ibn Tawas replied, "The Prophet of God has said, the worst punished criminals in the day of judgment will be those to whom God has entrusted authority and who have abused it." The Caliph was silent, and there was a pause. I trembled and drew my garments close round me, lest any of the blood of Ibn Taus, whom I expected to see instantly executed, should spirt upon them. Then the Caliph said to Ibn Taus, "Hand me that ink pot." But he never stirred. "Why don't you hand it?" asked the Caliph. "Because," he said, "I fear you may write some wrong order, and I do not wish to share the responsibility." "Get up and go," the Caliph growled. "Precisely what we were desiring," answered Ibn Taus, of whose courage and coolness I, from that day, formed a high opinion. End of section 90. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 91 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. The World Story, Volume 3, Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 91. Al-Mahdi and the Two Wishes, 8th century AD. Adapted from the Arabic by Claude Field. Al-Mahdi, the third caliph of the Abbasid dynasty, succeeded his father, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, AD 774. He was as prodigal as his father was avaricious, and rapidly squandered his vast inheritance. Al-Mansur had appointed as his instructor, before he succeeded to the throne, Sharki ibn Kotami, who was learned in all the lore and traditions of the Arabs. One evening Al-Mahdi asked his preceptor to divert him with some amusing anecdote. "I obey, Prince. May God protect you," answered Sharki. They relate that a certain king of Hira had two courtiers whom he loved equally with himself. They never quitted his society night or day, in the palace or on a journey. He took no decision without consulting them, and his wishes coincided with theirs. Thus they lived together a long time, but one evening the king, having drunk to excess, drew his sword from the sheath, and, rushing upon his two friends, killed them. Then he fell into a drunken slumber. The next morning, when told of what he had done, he cast himself upon the earth, biting it in his fury, weeping for his friends, and bewailing the loss of them. He fasted for some days, and swore that for the rest of his life he would abstain from the beverage which had deprived him of reason. Then he had them buried, and erected a shrine over their remains, to which he gave the title El Gharean, the two effigies. He commanded, in addition, that no person should pass this monument without prostrating themselves. Now, like the laws of the Medes and Persians, every custom set up by a king of Hira could not be changed, but became a hard and fast tradition, handed on from generation to generation. The command, therefore, of the king was rigidly observed. His subjects, of low and high degree, never passed before the double tomb without prostrating themselves. This usage gradually acquired the binding force of a religious rite. The king had ordered that anyone who refused to conform to it should be punished with death after expressing two wishes, which would be granted, no matter what they were. One day a fuller passed, bearing on his back a bundle of clothes and a mallet. The guardians of the mausoleum ordered him to kneel down. He refused. They threatened him with death. He persisted in his refusal. They brought him before the king, whom they informed of the matter. "Why did you refuse to bow down?" asked the king. "I did bow down," answered the man. "They are lying." "No, you are the liar," said the king. "Express two wishes, they shall be granted, and then you will die." "Nothing, then, can save me from death after those men have accused me?" asked the fuller. "Nothing." "Very well," replied the fuller. "Here is my wish. I wish to strike the king on the head with this mallet." "Fool!" answered the king. It were better worth your while to let me enrich those whom you leave behind you." "No," said the fuller, "I only wish to strike the king on the back of his head." The king then addressed his ministers. "What do you think," he said to them, "of the wish of this madman?" "Your Majesty," they answered, "you yourself have instituted this law. Your Majesty knows better than anyone else that the violation of law is a shame, a calamity, a crime which involves damnation. Besides, after having violated one law, you will violate a second, then a third. Your successors will do the same, and all our laws will be profaned." The king replied, "Get this man to ask anything he likes. Provided he lets me off, I am ready to grant all his requests, even to the half of my kingdom." They laid these proposals before the fuller, but in vain. He declared that he had no other wish but to strike the king. The latter, seeing that the man was thoroughly resolved, convoked a public assembly. The fuller was introduced. He took his mallet and struck the king on the back of his head so violent a blow that he fell from his throne and lay stretched on the ground unconscious. Subsequently, he lay ill with fever for 6 months and was so severely injured that he could only drink a drop at a time. At last he got well, recovered the use of his tongue, and could eat and drink. He asked for news of the fuller. On being told that he was in prison, he summoned him and said, "There is still a wish remaining to you. Express it so that I may order your death according to law." "Since it is absolutely necessary that I must die," replied the fuller, "I wish to strike you another blow on the head." At these words the king was seized with dismay and exclaimed that it was all over with him. At last he said to the fuller, "Wretch, renounce a claim which is profitless to you. What advantage have you reaped from your first wish? Ask for something else, and whatever it is, I will grant it." "No," said the man, "I only demand my right, the right to strike you once more." The king again consulted his ministers, who answered that the best thing for him was to resign himself to death, in obedience to the law. "But," said the king, "if he strikes me again, I shall never be able to drink any more. I know what I have already suffered." "We cannot help that, your Majesty," answered the ministers. Finding himself in this extremity, the king said to the fuller, "Answer, fellow. That day when you were brought hither by the guardians of the mausoleum, did I not hear you declare that you had prostrated yourself and that they had slandered you?" "Yes, I did say so," answered the fuller, "but you would not believe me." The king jumped from his seat, embraced the fuller, and exclaimed, "I swear that you are more truthful than these rascals, and that they have lied at your expense. I give you their place, and authorize you to inflict upon them the punishment they have deserved." Al-Mahdi laughed heartily on hearing this story, complimented the narrator, and rewarded him generously. End of section 91. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 92 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World Story, Volume 3, Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 92. Haroun Al Rashid and the Musician, 8th century A.D. Adapted from the Arabic by Claude Field. Ibrahim Muzeli relates the following story. Rashid one day summoned all his musicians. I and Meskin of Medina were among the performers. Rashid had partaken freely of wine and wished to hear performed an air which had suddenly occurred to his mind. The officer stationed before the curtain which concealed the Caliph told Ibn Jami to sing this piece. The latter obeyed, but did not succeed in pleasing the Caliph. Each of the singers present attempted it, but were no more successful than Ibn Jami. Then the officer, addressing Meskin, said, "The commander of the faithful orders you to sing this air if you can do it properly." Meskin commenced at once to sing, to the great surprise of the audience, who could not understand how a musician like him had the courage to attempt before us an air which none of us had been able to render to the satisfaction of the Caliph. As soon as he had finished, I heard Rashid raise his voice and ask to hear it a second time. Meskin recommenced with a skill and spirit which won him everybody's applause. The Caliph congratulated and praised him to the skies. Then he had the curtain behind which he had been sitting drawn aside. "Prince of the believers," then said Meskin to him, "a strange story attaches to this piece," and at the invitation of the Caliph he narrated it in these words: "I was formerly a slave of a member of the family of Zobeir, and carried on the trade of a tailor. My master claimed from me a tax of 2 dirhams daily, after paying which I was free to do what I liked. I was passionately fond of singing. One day a descendant of Ali, for whom I had just completed a tunic, paid me 2 dirhams for it, kept me to eat with him, and made me drink generously. As I left him, I met a negress carrying her pitcher on her shoulder and singing the song you have just heard. I was so delighted at it that, forgetting everything else, I said to her, 'By the Prophet, I adjure thee to teach me that air.' 'By the Prophet,' she answered, 'I will not teach it unless you pay me 2 dirhams.' Then, Prince of Believers, I took out the 2 dirhams with which I intended to pay my daily tax, and gave them to the negress. She, setting her pitcher down, sat on the ground, and keeping time with her fingers on the pitcher, sang the piece and repeated it till it was well impressed on my memory. I then proceeded to my master. As soon as he saw me he demanded his 2 dirhams, and I related my adventure to him. 'Scoundrel,' he said, 'have I not warned you that I will take no excuse even if a farthing is missing?' Saying this, he laid me on the ground, and with the utmost vigour of his arm gave me 50 strokes of a rod, and as an additional disgrace caused my head and chin to be shaved. Verily, O Prince, I passed a melancholy night. The severe punishment I had undergone made me forget the piece I had learnt, and this was the saddest of all. In the morning, wrapping my head in a cloak, I hid my large tailor's scissors in my sleeve, and directed my steps to the spot where I had met the negress. I waited there in perplexity, not knowing her name nor her abode. All at once I saw her coming. The sight of her dispersed all my cares. I approached her, and she said to me, 'By the Lord of the Kabah, you have forgotten the song.' 'Yes, I have,' I answered. I told her how my head and chin had been shaved, and offered her a reward if she would sing her song again. 'By the Prophet,' she answered, 'I will not, for less than 2 dirhams.' I took out my scissors, and ran and pawned them for 2 dirhams, which I gave her. She put down her pitcher, and began to sing as she had done the evening before. But as soon as she began, I said, 'Give me back the 2 dirhams. I don't need your song.' 'By Allah,' she said, 'you shall not see them again. Don't think it.' Then she added, 'I am certain that the 4 dirhams you have spent will be worth to you 4,000 dinars from the hand of the Caliph.' Then she resumed her song, accompanying herself as before on her pitcher, and did not cease repeating it till I had got it by heart. We separated. I returned to my master, but in a state of great apprehension. When he saw me, he demanded his daily due, while I stammered out excuses. 'Beast,' he shouted, 'was not yesterday's lesson enough for you?' 'I wish to speak to you frankly and without falsehood,' I answered. 'Yesterday's and today's dirhams went in payment for a song,' and I began to sing it to him. 'What!' he exclaimed, 'you have known an air like that for 2 days, and told me nothing of it? May my wife be divorced if it is not true that I would have let you go yesterday if you had sung it to me. Your head and chin have been shaved, I cannot help that, but I let you off your tax till your hair grows again.' Hearing this recital, Rashid laughed heartily, and said to the musician, 'I don't know which is better, your song or your story. I will see in my turn that the forecast of the negress is verified.' So Meskin went out from the Caliph's presence richer by 4,000 dinars. End of section 92. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Gould.
Section 93 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World Story Volume 3, Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 93. The Caliph and the Poet of the Barmeks. 8th century AD by E. H. Palmer. After the fall of the Barmek family, Haroun forbade the poets to write elegies upon them.
imposing severe penalties upon anyone who should act contrary to this regulation. It so happened that some of the night watch were passing by one of the ruined palaces which had formerly belonged to the unfortunate family, when they came upon a man with a strip of paper in his hand, containing an elegy upon the Barmeks, which he was reciting, weeping as he did so. The watch arrested him and took him before Al Rashid, to whom he at once acknowledged the fact. "Did you not know of my prohibition?" said the Caliph. "I'll make an example of you. If your Majesty will hear my story first," said the prisoner. "You may do what you please." "Go on," said Haroun. "Formerly," commenced the poet, "I was one of the least of Yahya bin Khalid's clerks. One day the vizier said to me, 'I wish you to entertain me at your house some time or other.' I replied, 'Oh, my lord, I am not deserving of such an honor, and my house is quite unfit for you.' And as he would take no denial, I asked for a year's delay that I might make fitting preparations. But he would not allow me more than a few months. So I set about my preparations, and as soon as they were completed to the best of my ability, I informed the minister that I was ready to receive him. The next day he came to me with his 2 sons, Jafar and El Fadl, and a few of his private suite. Then he stopped his horse at my door and alighted. 'Now then,' he said, 'I am hungry. Make haste and get me something to eat.' And his son, El Fadl, whispered, 'He likes roast fowl. Bring whatever you have got as soon as possible.' So I went in and got the dinner ready. When the vizier had finished eating, he got up and walked about the place, and then said suddenly, 'Now then, sir, show me all over your house.' I answered, 'This is my house, my lord. I have no other.' 'Oh, yes, you have,' said he. 'You have another.' I assured him that it was the only one I possessed, whereupon he called for some masons, and when they appeared, he commanded them to break open a door in the wall. In this I remonstrated and said, 'Oh, my lord, how can I break into my neighbor's house when God has commanded us to respect our neighbor's rights?' 'Never mind,' he said, and when the door was made, we all went through it, and came into a beautiful garden, well planted with fruit and flowers, with fountains bubbling up, and summer houses, and dwellings, and everything that could delight the eye. The house itself was beautifully furnished, and filled with servants and slave girls, everything on a most magnificent scale. 'This house,' said the vizier, 'and all belonging to it is yours.' Then I kissed his hands and prayed for blessings on him, and he turned to his son Jafar and said, 'How is he to keep up this establishment, my boy?' And Jafar said, 'I will give him such and such an estate, and make out of the conveyance of it to him immediately.' Then Yahya turned to El Fadl and said, 'What is he to do, my boy, for ready money until he receives the revenues of his estate?' 'Oh,' said El Fadl, 'I will give him 10,000 dinars, and bring them to him myself.' 'Well, make haste then,' said the father, 'both of you.' They were as good as their word, and I entered into possession of the house and the estate, and received the ready cash, and have made a large fortune with it over and above what they gave me. And I enjoy it now, and God knows, O Prince of the Faithful, I have never lost an opportunity of showing my gratitude to them, although I can never repay the obligations I owe them. And if you like to kill me for that, you can, so do as you like." Al Rashid was touched at the man's story, and had the common humanity to let him go. He also from that day removed his prohibition, and allowed the poets to write elegies on the beloved but unfortunate family. End of section 93. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 94 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, read for LibriVox.org by Thomas Peter. The Division of the Reward, 8th century A.D., by E. H. Palmer. Haroun Al Rashid suffered much from sleeplessness, and, to divert himself, would either walk incognito through the streets of Baghdad, accompanied by his trusty companions, Jaffa and Mesrour, or he would recline and listen to amusing stories or sentimental poetry. This furnishes really the motive for a great part of the tales of the Arabian Nights, many of the histories there related being told to soothe the Caliph in his restless moods. During one of these fits, he said to Jaffa, "I am sleepless tonight, and my heart is contracted, and I know not what to do." On this Mesrour, who was standing by, burst out laughing, and Haroun sharply asked, "Dost thou laugh at me, or art thou mad?" "No, by Allah, O Commander of the Faithful," said the attendant. "By thy relationship to the chief of the apostles, I could not help it. It was the sudden recollection of a man named Ibn el-Karibi, whom I saw yesterday amusing a crowd on the banks of the Tigris, which made me laugh, for which I humbly beg your Majesty's pardon." "Bring him here at once," said Al-Rashid, and Mesrour, having found the wag, brought him to the palace, but, before admitting him, bargained with him that he should give him 2/3 of whatever he might receive from the Caliph. To this Ibn el-Karibi agreed after much wrangling, and the two were ushered into the imperial presence. After the usual ceremonious greeting, the Caliph said, "If you do not make me laugh, I will beat you 3 times with this leathern bag," pointing to one which lay beside him. The fellow, who was not without experience of correction from more formidable-looking instruments, having indeed more than once brought himself into personal communication with the bastinado, thought but little of 3 blows with a leathern bag, and put forth all his strength to divert the sovereign, uttering drolleries enough to make a melancholy madman laugh, but not a muscle of the Caliph's face was seen to move. "Now," said the Commander of the Faithful, "you have deserved the beating," and taking up the leathern bag, struck the jester 1 blow therewith, eliciting a howl, for the bag was filled with large pebbles, and caused no trifling pain. Begging for a moment's respite, he told Haroun of the bargain between himself and Mesrour, and begged that the 2 remaining blows might be given to the attendant as his share, according to agreement. Mesrour was then called in, and on receiving the first installment, cried out, "O Prince of the Faithful, the 3rd is enough for me. Give him the 2/3. This restored the Caliph's good temper, and, laughing heartily, he rewarded them both. End of section 94. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 95 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The World's Story, Volume 3, Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 95, The Caliph and the Man with the Stew, 8th century A.D., by E. H. Palmer. Ibrahim el-Mosili relates that he went out one day to take the air and get rid of the effects of a too heavy drinking bout, when he perceived a smell of cooking that aroused his appetite. Having ordered his servant to find out from which house the odor proceeded, he presented himself at the door and requested the girl who opened it to allow him to partake of the meal that was being prepared. The girl went to her mistress and at once returned with permission for them to enter. She then tasted the contents of a pot that was upon the fire and set a dish of it before the visitors. Ibrahim found it very savory, ate heartily, and was about to take his departure, when the lady of the house sent word out to say that she regretted the absence of her husband, who would, she was sure, have been pleased to entertain them further and to drink with them. As he was leaving, he passed a man riding upon an ass, who turned out to be the master himself. He, having learned from the girl what had happened, rode after Ibrahim and insisted on bringing him back to the house, where, taking him into the best apartment, he set before his guest an elegant dessert and some excellent wine, and the two kept up the carousel until the evening. The next day Ibrahim was told that the Caliph had over and over again sent for him during his absence, so he hurried to the palace, and by way of making his excuses told his adventures, and waxed eloquent upon the savory nature of the stew he had tasted. The Caliph was amused, and said, "Did he not ask you who you were?" "No," replied Ibrahim, "we had plenty else to do." Haroun wished to taste the dish for himself, and ordered Ibrahim to procure an invitation for them both, without acquainting their host with their names and rank. This was easily arranged for the next night, Ibrahim telling the hospitable stranger that his friend was deeply in debt, and dared not show himself by day for fear of his creditors. So the Caliph and his companion mounted 2 asses and rode to the house, where they were cordially received and entertained. The Caliph declared he had never tasted anything like the stew, was charmed with all he saw and heard, and asked his host about his circumstances. "My father," said he, "left me a large property, and I dissipated the greater part of it, but I retrenched in time, and, thank Allah, now I want for nothing." Presently the fumes of the wine and the songs of the singing girls who were present so expanded the Caliph's heart that he told Ibrahim to take their host aside and tell him who he was. So Ibrahim said, "Do you know who your guest is?" "No," said he. "Why, he is the commander of the faithful himself." The man, on hearing this, laughed till he rolled over on his back and kept calling out, "Oh, what a wonderfully good thing! Oh, you wag!" At this the Caliph laughed immoderately too, and the man called out to his wife, "What do you think of our guests? They have got drunk and repay my hospitality by making fun of me, and one of them declares he is the Prince of the Faithful." Then, offering a glass with mock humility to Al Rashid, he said, "Drink, Commander of the Faithful," and Haroun left the Moor. "But," said Ibrahim, "it is really the Commander of the Faithful." "Pray, stop your drunken jokes," said the other. "You have only drunk a couple of glasses, and have turned this fellow into the Commander of the Faithful. In another half an hour you will make him out to be the Prophet himself." When daylight began to appear, the party broke up. Ibrahim, failing to convince his host of the truth of his communication, told him to ask his neighbors in the morning after El Malik, the king, and after Ibrahim el Mosili, and when asked his name, to reply that he was the man with the stew. In the morning his neighbors said to him, "What a noisy party you had last night! Who were your 2 guests?" When he had told them all, one of the neighbors said, "Tell me what they were like," and on hearing the description declared his conviction that it really was the Caliph. So the man went off to the house of Ibrahim el Mosili and sent word in that the man with the stew had called. Ibrahim at once admitted him, rode with him to the palace, and presented him to Al Rashid, who insisted on his repeating his sarcastic observations of the previous night, which he did, to Haroun's great delight. The Caliph ordered an immense sum of money to be given to him, and bade him tell him the receipt for the celebrated stew. "No, Commander of the Faithful," said he, "if I were to give away a thing that has proved so valuable to me, I should have no advantage left in it. I shall be happy to cook it for the Commander of the Faithful whenever he pleases." Haroun was content with the reply, and the lucky host was ever afterwards known as the man with the stew. End of section 95. This recording is in the public domain. Section 96 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, read for LibriVox.org by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Poet and the Jester, 8th century A.D., by E. H. Palmer. Zobeide, wife of Haroun Al Rashid, never ceased to urge upon her husband the claims of her son Emin to the entire succession as belonging to the pure Hashimi race on both parents' sides, and she was exceedingly jealous of Haroun's other son, Mamoun, whom she hated not only as the child of a rival, but as having Persian blood in his veins, and more particularly because of the much more brilliant intellect which he displayed. This subject was the cause of many stormy scenes between the royal pair, several of which are related by the Arab historians on the authority of eyewitnesses. On one occasion, the story goes, the fond mother asserted that Emin was an excellent poet and induced him to submit some of his verses to the court jester Abu Nawas's criticism. When the latter pointed out some gross violation of the rules of prosody in one of the lines, the young prince flew into a passion and caused Abu Nawas to be imprisoned. Some time after, Haroun Al Rashid sent for the poet, was surprised to learn of his incarceration and the reason of it, and severely reproved his son. Emin asked to be allowed to read some other verses in the presence of his father, as well as of Abu Nawas, and the caliph acceded to his request. As soon as the Abu Nawas had heard the first few lines, he started up to leave the room. "Where are you going?" asked Haroun. "Back to prison," was the reply. End of section 96. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 97 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. Read for LibriVox.org. Arabia, Part 3. Stories of Modern Arabia. Historical Note. The world owes much to the Arabians or Saracens for preserving and increasing its knowledge of science and literature through the Dark Ages. They were students and investigators, and the results of their work they gave to others by establishing schools in their principal cities. Some of this culture was imbibed by the Crusaders, and on their return was spread throughout Europe, where it was a potent factor in bringing to an end the ignorance and brutality of the Dark Ages. Unfortunately for the Caliphate, dissensions arose among the Muslims. Numerous lesser chiefs of Arabia, while willing to acknowledge the ruling caliph as head of their faith, refused to accept his sway in temporal matters. In the middle of the 18th century, one Wahhabi arose, a religious reformer who did not object to holding temporal sway. His power increased, and early in the 19th century, even Mecca came under the rule of his successors. Warfare with Egypt led to the downfall of the Wahhabi rule, but about the middle of the century they succeeded in again establishing their control. A wide strip of land along the coast, including Mecca, is in the hands of Turkey. Aden has since 1839 been held by Great Britain. The region of Nejd and the deserts in the southeast are under Arab control. End of section 97. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 98 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World Story, Volume 3, Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 98. Justice in Arabia, 19th Century, by Colonel L. Ducouré. After the evening prayer, I took my way to the tower, calling by the way on Said Ahmed, with whom in our late ramble I had arranged for an early meeting. "Sidi," said I, addressing him, "I was going to avail myself this evening of your invitation to visit you whenever convenient to myself. But Said Abd el-Rahman having sent word that he expects me after the evening prayer, I called to say that I must defer that pleasure until another time." "It so happens," rejoined Said Ahmed, "that I too am going to the tower, for tonight the Naguib sits there in judgment. Every second night after the last prayer the Naguib dispenses justice to the Marabes, and this is an evening for the session of a Messaur tribunal." I proceeded with him to the tower, where we found the Naguib seated upon his cushions at the door of the vestibule. There, surrounded by his chiefs and a crowd of retainers, he rendered important decisions while smoking his chicha. The audience was a large one, for Said Abd el-Rahman was very popular with his people, owing in great measure to his accessibility to all. Mussulman, Sabian, or Jew, provided only he was of the country, enjoyed the privilege of access to him at all times to state his case, on which the Naguib at once rendered justice, by a decree based upon equity as well as common sense. Said Ahmed took the place reserved for him among the members of the tribunal, while for myself, after the interchange of the usual compliments, the Naguib ordered a chibuk to be brought, which he lighted and presented to me with his own hands. Curious to witness an example of the justice of the country, I took up the most convenient position for seeing and hearing, as the audience commenced. There were women who complained of ill treatment on the part of their husbands, men who accused their wives of frailty, divisions of inheritance to adjust, thefts and frauds to punish, among all which cases there were two particularly remarkable for the judgments rendered upon them. The first of these cases was one between a katib and a fallah, that is, a rider and a peasant, the wife of the latter having been taken away from him by the former, who maintained that he had a claim upon her. The woman declined to acknowledge either the one or the other of them as her husband, or rather she acknowledged them both, a view of the case which rendered it decidedly embarrassing. Having heard both sides and reflected a moment, the Naguib said, addressing the claimants, "Leave this woman here, and return in half an hour," on which the Katib and Fallah made their salutations and retired. The second case was between a Fakeh and a Zibdai, or in other words, a fruiterer and a butter merchant, the latter very much besmeared with butter, the former clean. The fruiterer said, "I had been to buy some butter from this man, and drew out my purse full of money to pay for the butter he had put in my gaula. When tempted by the sight of the coins, he seized me by the wrist. I cried, 'Thief!' but he would not let me go, and thus have we come before you, I squeezing my money in my hand, and he grasping my wrist with his. And now by Mohammed, our great prophet, I swear that this man lies in saying that I have stolen his money, for that money is truly mine." The butter merchant said, "This man came to buy a gula of butter from me, and when I filled it, he said, 'Hast thou change of an Abu Mathfa?' a Spanish piaster. I searched my pocket, from which I drew out my hand full of money, which I placed upon the sill of my shop, from which he snatched it, and was going off with my butter and my money, when I seized him by the wrist and cried, 'Thief!' But in spite of my cries he refused to return my property to me, and I have brought him hither in order that you may judge between us. And now by Mohammed, our great prophet, I swear that this man lies in saying I have stolen his money, for that money is truly mine." The Naguib caused the complainants to repeat their charges twice, but neither of them varied from his first statement. Then he said, after a moment's reflection, "Leave this money here and return in half an hour," on which the fruiterer, who had all along kept his hold of the money, deposited it in a wooden bowl, brought by one of the guards, and both complainants, having made their salutations, retired. When they were gone, the Naguib quitted his seat at the door of the vestibule, and went up into the 4th story of the tower, taking with him the woman and money in dispute. At the appointed moment he returned with them, and went calmly back to his seat. The parties interested were all present, and the Katib and Fallah were called up. "Here," said the Naguib, addressing the Katib, "take thy wife and lead her away, for she is thine truly." Then turning to his guards and pointing to the Fallah, he said, "Give this man 50 blows of a courbash on the soles of his feet." The Katib walked off with his wife, and the guards gave the Fallah 50 blows of a courbash on the soles of his feet. Next came the fruiterer and the butter merchant in their turn. "Here," said the Naguib to the fruiterer, "here is thy money. Verily didst thou take it from thine own purse, and never did it belong to him by whom thou art accused." Then turning to his guards and pointing to the butter merchant, he said, "Give this man 50 blows of a courbash on the soles of his feet." The fruiterer walked off with his money, and the guards gave the butter merchant 50 blows of a courbash on the soles of his feet. When the court had risen, I asked the Naguib how he ascertained that the woman was the wife of the Katib, and the money the property of the fruiterer. "Nothing more simple," replied he. "You saw how I went up into the 4th story with the woman and the money. Well, when we arrived there, I ordered her suddenly to clean my inkhorn, when, like one accustomed to that work, she at once took it, drew out the cotton from it, washed it properly, replaced it on the stand, and filled it with fresh ink. Then I said to myself, if you were the wife of the Fallah, you never could have cleaned an inkhorn like that. You must be the wife of the Khatib. Good, said I, bowing in token of assent. So much for the woman. And how about the money? The money was quite another business, replied the Nagib, smiling with a self-satisfied expression as he leered at me with a look full of artfulness and craft. You must have remarked how buttery the butter merchant was, and how greasy his hands were in particular. Well, I put the money into a vessel of hot water, and upon examining the water carefully I could not find that a single particle of grease had come to the surface. Then I said to myself, this money belongs to the fruiterer and not to the butter merchant, for had it belonged to the latter it must have been greasy, and the grease would have shown on the surface of the water. At this I bowed very low indeed, and said in good faith, I doubt whether the great King Solomon himself could have rendered a decision with more sagacity and wisdom. Until then I had always looked upon the tales related to us in the Arabian Nights as mere fictions, but on witnessing the delivery of these two judgments I felt convinced that some of them at least were founded on facts. Of course they are worked up into romances, but they have a basis of reality. End of section 98. Recording by DrPGould.
Section 99 of Egypt, Africa and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The World Story, Volume 3, Egypt, Africa and Arabia. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 99. Wit from Arabia. By Colonel L. Ducouré. 1. One morning, Nasir Eddin Effendi ascended into his pulpit to preach, and addressing his hearers, said, O believers, know ye what I am going to talk to you about? They replied that they did not. Well then, rejoined he, since you do not know, do you suppose that I am going to tell you? Another morning he again appeared in the pulpit and said, O believers, know ye not what I am going to tell you? They replied that they did. If you know it then, said he, I need not tell it to you. And he descended from the pulpit and went his way. His auditors, puzzled what to do, at length agreed that, if he again made his appearance, some of them would say that they knew, others that they did not. And again Nasir Eddin Effendi mounted into the pulpit and said, O Mussulmans, know ye what I am going to say to you? To which some replied, We know, others, We know not. Good, returned he, let those who know tell those who do not. 2. A fellah came in from the country one morning, bringing a gazelle to Nasir Eddin Effendi, who received it very graciously, and invited the donor to dine with him. A week afterwards the same man again came to see him, but Nasir Eddin Effendi, having forgotten him, asked him who he was. I am he who brought you the gazelle, replied the man, upon which Nasir Eddin Effendi welcomed him as before. Some days after this, certain strangers having come to claim his hospitality, he asked them who they were. We are the neighbors of him who brought you the gazelle, answered they, and he received them as his guests. Shortly after, yet others presented themselves, who, on being asked by him who they were, replied, We are the neighbors of the man who brought you the gazelle. And Nasir Eddin Effendi, bidding them welcome, placed before them a cup of cold water only, saying, Drink. It is the broth of the gazelle. 3. One evening Nasir Eddin Effendi borrowed a pot from one of his neighbors, and having finished cooking with it, he put a stew-pan inside it and returned it to the owner. The latter, seeing the stew-pan, asked Nasir Eddin Effendi what it was. The pot has had a young one, replied the latter, and went his way. Another time he again borrowed the pot, took it home with him, and did not return it. 5 days after, the owner of the pot, surprised at its not having been returned, went to Nasir Eddin Effendi and asked him for it. Allah be merciful to you, exclaimed the latter. Your pot is dead." "What?" cried the other. "Do pots die?" "Come now," retorted Nasir Eddin Effendi. "You were ready enough to believe that pots can bring forth young ones. Why then should they not die?" 4. One day a beggar knocked at the door of Nasir Eddin Effendi. "What do you want here?" asked the latter. "Come down," said the beggar man. Nasir Eddin Effendi came down and again asked him what he wanted. "I seek for alms," said the beggar man. "Good," exclaimed Nasir Eddin Effendi. "Go upstairs." The beggar man went up, and then Nasir Eddin Effendi said to him, "The blessing of Allah be upon you." "But why did you not say that while I was below, O Sidi?" asked the beggar man. "Why yourself?" retorted Nasir Eddin Effendi. "When I was upstairs, why did you ask me to come down?" End of section 99. This recording is in the public domain. Section 100 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. Read for LibriVox.org by Sonia. Arabian Horsemen in Battle by Adolf Schreier, German painter, 1828. Painting, page 536. The sky is deep blue and cloudy, the ground rocky and broken. Far away at the horizon on the left, the smoke from the guns of the enemy may be seen. Galloping rapidly into the foreground of the picture come a troop of Arabs. A shell has just exploded, and the chief's horse, a magnificent dapple grey, springs forward in a moment's alarm. The white horse of the standard-bearer swerves to the right. This is the moment of the picture. The famous horses of Arabia are distinguished by their broad foreheads, expressive eyes, and tapering muzzles. On a slender fare of barley, dates, and camel's milk, they will make a daily journey of 60 or 80 miles for many days in succession. They share the tent of their master, and are his comrades and playmates. He treats them like petted children, and they respond with a rare docility and intelligence. An Arab will almost as soon sell his child as his beloved horse. End of section 100. This recording is in the public domain. Section 101 of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The World Story, Volume 3, Egypt, Africa, and Arabia. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 101. A Pilgrimage to Mecca by Sir Richard F. Burton. In 1853, Captain Richard F. Burton determined to make the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. He had an Eastern cast of countenance and could speak Arabic and Persian with ease. He spent some time in familiarizing himself with Mohammedan ways, prayers, ablutions, and prostrations, and at Suez joined a company of pilgrims. How well he carried out his assumed character may be known from the fact that his attendant had no idea that he was not a fellow Mohammedan. The Editor. Having resolved to perform the Mecca pilgrimage, I spent a few months at Cairo, and on the 22nd of May embarked in a small steamer at Suez with the Mahmil, or litter, and its military escort, conveying the Kiswa, or covering for the Kabah. On the 25th, the man at the wheel informed us that we were about to pass the village of Rabik, on the Arabian coast, and that the time had consequently arrived for changing our usual habiliments for the ihram, or pilgrim costume of 2 towels, and for taking the various interdictory vows involved in its assumption, such as not to tie knots in any portion of our dress, not to oil the body, and not to cut our nails or hair, nor to improve the tints of the latter with the coppery hue of henna. Transgression of these and other ceremonial exactments is expiated either by animal sacrifice or gifts of fruit or cereals to the poor. After a complete ablution and assuming the ihram, we performed 2 prayer flections and recited the meritorious sentences beginning with the words Labaik Allahumma labaik. Here I am, O God, here I am. Here I am, O unassociated one. Here I am, for unto thee belong praise, grace, and empire, O unassociated one. This prayer was repeated so often, people not unfrequently rushing up to their friends and shrieking the sacred sentence into their ears, that at last it became a signal for merriment rather than an indication of piety. On the 26th we reached Jeddah, where the utter sterility of Arabia, with its dunes and rocky hills, becomes apparent. The town, however, viewed from the sea, is not unpicturesque. Many European vessels were at anchor off the coast, and as we entered the port, innumerable small fishing boats darting in all directions, their sails no longer white, but emerald green from the intense luster of the water, crowded around us on all sides, and reminded one by their dazzling colors and rapidity of motion of the shoals of porpoises so often seen on a voyage round the Cape. On disembarking we were accosted by several mutawafs, or circuit men, so termed in Arabic because besides serving as religious guides in general, their special duty is to lead the pilgrim in his 7 obligatory circuits around the Kabah. We encamped outside the town, and having visited the tomb of our mother Eve, mounted our camels for Mecca. After a journey of 20 hours across the desert, we passed the barriers which mark the outermost limit of the sacred city, and ascending some giant steps, pitched our tents on a plain, or rather plateau, surrounded by barren rock, some of which, distant but a few yards, mask from view the birthplace of the Prophet. It was midnight. A few drops of rain were falling, and lightning played around us. Day after day we had watched its brightness from the sea, and many a faithful Hadji had pointed out to his companions those fires which were heaven's witness to the sanctity of the spot. Alhamdulillah. Thanks be to God. We were now at length to gaze upon the Qibla, to which every Mussulman has turned in prayer since the days of Mohammed, and which for long ages before the birth of Christianity was reverenced by the patriarchs of the East. Soon after dawn arose from our midst the shout of Labaik, Labaik, and passing between the rocks we found ourselves in the main street of Mecca, and approached the Gateway of Salvation, one of the 39 portals of the Temple of Salvation. On crossing the threshold we entered a vast unroofed quadrangle, a mighty amplification of the Palais Royal, having on each side of its 4 sides a broad colonnade, divided into 3 aisles by a multitude of slender columns, and rising to the height of about 30 feet. Surmounting each arch of the colonnade is a small dome. In all there are 120, and at different points rise 7 minarets, dating from various epochs, and of somewhat varying altitudes and architecture. The numerous pigeons which have their home within the temple have been believed never to alight upon any portion of its roof, thus miraculously testifying to the holiness of the building. This marvel, however, of late years having been suspended, many discern another omen of the approach of the long-predicted period when unbelievers shall desecrate the hallowed soil. In the center of the square area rises the far-famed Kabah, the funereal shade of which contrasts vividly with the sunlit walls and precipices of the town. It is a cubical structure of massive stone, the upper 2/3 of which are mantled by a black cloth embroidered with silver, and the lower portion hung with white linen. At a distance of several yards it is surrounded by a balustrade provided with lamps, which are lighted in the evening, and the space thus enclosed is the circuit ground along which, day and night, crowds of pilgrims performing the circular ceremony of tawaf realize the idea of perpetual motion. We at once advanced to the black stone embedded in an angle of the Kabah, kissed it, and exclaimed, Bismillah wa Allahu Akbar, in God's name, and God is greatest. Then we commenced the usual 7 rounds, 3 at a walking pace, and 4 at a brisk trot. Next followed 2 prayer flections at the tomb of Abraham, after which we drank of the water of Zamzam, said to be the same which quenched the thirst of Hagar's exhausted son. Besides the Kabah, 8 minor structures adorn the quadrangle: the well of Zamzam, the library, the clock-room, the triangular staircase, and 4 ornamental resting places for the orthodox sects of Hanafi, Shafi, Maliki, and Hanbali. We terminated our morning duties by walking and running 7 times along the streets of Safa and Marwa, so named from the flight of 7 steps at each of its extremities. After a few days spent in visiting various places of interest, such as the slave market and forts, and the houses of the Prophet and the Caliphs Ali and Abu Bakr, we started on our 6 hours' journey to the mountain of Arifat, an hour's sojourn at which, even in a state of insensibility, confers the rank of Hadji. It is a mountain spur of about 150 feet in height, presenting an artificial appearance from the wall encircling it and the terrace on its slope, from which the Imam delivers a sermon before the departure of his congregation for Mecca. His auditors were, indeed, numerous, their tents being scattered over 2 or 3 miles of the country. A great number of their inmates were fellow subjects of ours from India. Footnote: Sir Richard posed as a native of Afghanistan. End of footnote. I surprised some of my Mecca friends by informing them that Queen Victoria numbers nearly 20 millions of Mohammedans among her subjects. On the 5th of June, at sunset, commencing our return, we slept at the village of Muzdalifah, and there gathered and washed 7 pebbles of the size of peas, to be flung at 3 piles of whitewashed masonry, known as the Shaitans, Satans of Muna. We acquitted ourselves satisfactorily of this duty on the festival of the 6th of June, the 10th day of the Arabian month Sul-Hijjah. Each of us then sacrificed a sheep, had his hair and nails cut, exchanged the ikram for his best apparel, and embracing his friends, paid them the compliments of the season. The 2 following days, the Great, the Middle, and the Little Satan, were again pelted, and bequeathing to the unfortunate inhabitants of Muna the unburied and odorous remains of nearly 100,000 animals, we returned, 80,000 strong, to Mecca. A week later, having helped to insult the tumulus of stones which marks, according to popular belief, the burial place of Abu Lahab the unbeliever, who we learn from the Koran has descended into hell with his wife, gatherer of sticks, I was not sorry to relinquish a shade temperature of 120 degrees, and went my way to Jeddah, en route for England, after delegating to my brethren the recital of a prayer in my behalf at the tomb of the Prophet at Medina. In penning these lines, I am anxious to encourage other Englishmen, especially those from India, to perform the pilgrimage, without being deterred by exaggerated reports concerning the perils of the enterprise. It must, however, be understood that it is absolutely indispensable to be a Mussulman, at least externally, and to have an Arabic name. Neither the Koran nor the Sultan enjoins the killing of intrusive Jews or Christians. Nevertheless, 2 years ago, an incognito Jew, who refused to repeat the creed, was crucified by the Mecca populace, and in the event of a pilgrim again declaring himself to be an unbeliever, the authorities would be almost powerless to protect his life. End of section 101. End of The World Story, A History of the World in Story, Song and Art. Volume 3, Egypt, Africa and Arabia. Edited by Eva March Tappan.